making sure that you get the right process to work on. And we all know that process identification is that first step in the life cycle. You create your taxonomy, you get a list of processes, then you're saying, which are the right process to work on?
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with various process practitioners that are putting BPM into practice on a day-to-day basis. So in organizations wanting to understand their processes, improve their processes, optimize these processes. The process management space is such a broad and diverse space. And so it's such a privilege that we get to learn from so many different speakers. We are into the episode over 150 now. I don't know the exact figure, but over 150 episodes now. And so there's a huge database of conversations. If you're just joining us for the first time, you've only recently stumbled across the series, there is a lot there for you to consume and glean from. And in today's conversation, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Nigel Adams for a second time. So Nigel has been on the podcast before, and we had a very extensive and comprehensive conversation last time. I believe, Nigel, it was one of our longest ones, over an hour long. Which, when you're passionate about process,
it's hard not to speak.
That's right. But for those that haven't seen that first episode with Nigel is a director and consultant at Hetton Advisory, but has also been at a very senior level at some of Australia's largest financial organisations. So has such a broad range of experience there, especially when it comes to process transformation, operational excellence. And so very excited for today's conversation. Nigel, thanks for joining me.
Yep. Thanks, Daniel. Good to be back. I'll try not to be sort of quite as long-winded, but I am very passionate about the topic. So great to be here.
No, that's fantastic. And that's what we want. I think for the community of process practitioners out there and those that just jumping into the space for the first time, we want to learn from those that have been there, done that, and are also very passionate about what they do. I've even had a comment recently about someone that felt like she was on her own in the process world. She didn't have many connections, didn't have many contacts, and she was questioning where the process was for her. She stumbled across the Process Pioneers podcast series, watched a couple of episodes, and she had like a light bulb moment. These are my people, and started connecting with them. And it's just really encouraging to see that as well. But I know you're doing a lot of research work in the process space. So can you start by giving us a bit of an overview of your more recent research on process selection in particular?
Yeah. So this, I guess, started over 20 years ago when I was I was working as a consultant at KPMG, and then continued into the first couple of roles I had in a couple of the banks where I was in charge of the operational excellence team. And we were obviously in those types of roles, you're doing lots of work around portfolio prioritization, selecting the right projects, the right processes for you to work on and to try and improve. And a lot of my background was around sort of developing the decision-making tools, the decision-making models to help sort of quantify and make the right decision for the organization to select the right processes. And invariably, we would go into the committees, the forums that actually was the decision-making body. We present our analysis, present our results, and our analysis would say, you should select process A. And the committee would decide on process B. And it was a real sort of conundrum, it was a real stumbling block, and I couldn't quite get to grips with it. And then as I went into line roles and started to work in payments and other areas, it sort of went to the back burner. In recent times, as I've started to do the work on process mining and how that can be applied in a compliance setting in banks, I came back to this because there was some work done about making sure that you get the right process to work on. And we all know that process identification is that first step in the life cycle. You create your taxonomy, you get a list of processes, then you're saying, which are the right process to work on? And so as part of this sort of wider research on process mining and compliance, I said, well, how do we make sure we know we get the right ones? Obviously, with process mining, you need a really good data set to help you, or else it's a bit of a no-go. So I started to do some digging around and found there's quite a lot of work had been done on context in other areas, how context should inform business process design. So I thought, well, there's not too much has actually been documented around the process selection step. There are lots and lots of quantitative models. There's lots of different tools out there, from simple sort of spreadsheets, scoring type sheets, to the analytical hierarchy process, all sorts of fuzzy models to try and make the right decision. But that basically takes us back to where I was, sort of a few years ago, when people would look at the model, say, yes, it's very nice, but we're not going to listen to it. We're going to go down a different path. So what I wanted to do is to say, okay, let me take a chance to sort of go and evaluate this, because the hard thing about it is it's impossible to prove that you're right or wrong at the process selection step. You only know whether it's been a good decision when you've actually finished the improvement cycle. Now, if the improvement cycle fails, is that because you picked the wrong process in the start, or was your execution flawed? You don't know. So it's very, very difficult to say in that process selection step, are we doing the right thing? So I had this bunch of stuff all sort of like swirling around. And I thought, I know what, I'll do some experiments. The last part of it was, because we're not very good at necessarily dealing with some of these issues in process selection, such as it's subjective, the data's hard to get, and how to synthesize the data. One of the things that tends to happen is organizations select a core process over a support process. That was some of the researchers found. And I was thinking about that and saying, well, most of the case, I probably agree. You should be going with your core process. They're the ones that generate the most value. But then this was in the middle of COVID when I was having this discussion. And there's this huge surge of effort to recruit technical resources, skilled software engineers, data analysts, etc. And I thought, if you are an organization that's wanting to grow rapidly and you are dependent on those resources, the most important process you have is recruitment and onboarding. And they're not core processes. So how do you make sure you get those selected? So there are a few things swirling around here. And so to bring that back to the research, what I did was I said, okay, well, I need to be able to measure whether we've made the right decision. As I said, it's pretty difficult. So I'm going to have to come up with a simulated scenario. So I picked a project goal, which I was familiar with from earlier work, and that was, how do we select processes to be included in a process mining project to try and improve business process compliance outcomes in a bank? Now, obviously, the process mining is only going to do the analytics part of it, but that was the context. That was the project goal. Mm. We wrote 2 process descriptions. They're short, only 2 paragraphs long. One for a core process, one for a support process. They weren't named. They're an amalgam of things. There were no facts in there. And anybody that's been in a banking process prioritization session would probably be very familiar with the fact that lots of times it's a good story that's told. That's the narrative of what we're trying to achieve. They were deliberately ambiguous. And so what we were trying to do was to get a bunch of bankers to go and say, which one would you prioritize here? So we ran a little Delphi study. It had 4 groups, 2 in what was the control group, setting the baseline, and 2 that were my test group. Now, when you do most people, when they're looking at how to prioritize process, they need criteria. And commonly that tends to be, is the process strategically important? What's its health like? Can it be improved? And is it feasible to do it? They're very generic criteria. So for our control group, we armed them with just those 3 criteria. Go and assess the process based on those 3 things. For our test groups, we gave them the same 3 criteria, but we also gave them a lot more context about what does strategically important mean from a compliance perspective? What does health mean from a compliance perspective? What does feasible mean from a compliance and a process mining perspective mean? And so it provided this extra information. And then at the end of it, we just asked them to make a recommendation. Which one are you most likely to recommend on a 6-point scale? So, are you going to recommend this definitely not or definitely? They only got to see one process. They couldn't see what they were comparing it to. And so we went through all of this, and so there were 24 people involved. And what came out was they all rated them exactly the same, basically, within 0.1, 0.2. So they all said somewhere between probably to definitely would recommend, whether you're in the control group or the test group, whether you had the core process or the support process. Now, we knew from sort of our expert overview of those processes, the support process was quite significantly better. That would have been a probably, and the core process should have been a possibly not, based on the factors that we knew were hidden inside of these subjective statements. So we were really, really confused. And we went through a focus group afterwards to start to get into, so what's driving this? How come you said we should, we rate them so highly? And of course, what we'd missed out on was that if you think of the inputs into that process selection decision, you've got the goal, that's pretty clear. You've got the alternatives that you're analyzing. You've got your criteria that you use and your technique that you use. The missing ingredient, of course, is the decision makers. And they're people. And what we found was that these people come with all sorts of bias. So they talked about how they read the description and they locked into a rating. They anchored on the rating, even though they were getting feedback from other people in their group with different opinions. No one changed their mind. They just locked it in. They talked about the issues of, if you want to get a bonus at the end of the year, you need to be seen to be making a difference. The way to be seen to be making a difference is to get hold of project funding so you can change a process. So it doesn't matter how good or bad your process is, you're still going to bid for it because you want the money so you can get a bonus. So you had this driving it. There were issues where on the feasibility front, even though the core process description would say there's no data and the requirements aren't clear because all the stakeholders are fighting about it, they would say, oh yeah, we can fix that. And there was this optimism that the feasibility could be addressed within the timeframe of the project. So people were desperate to get their project up and approved and desperate to overcome any obvious hurdles within it. So we then went back and we did a couple more scenarios where we tried to force them into like a sheep pen so they couldn't wriggle out of it. And so we asked very closed questions, limited to sort of just five simple questions. And for the last piece, we actually changed the framing. So rather than talking about this as an opportunity to improve, we framed it as a risk assessment. This is a huge risk. It's about compliance to the organization. And there's a major threat here. That changed the dynamic. So we then got to the recommendations that I guess the expert panel had made. Our decision quality had significantly improved, but the logic had fallen away. And those people who were behind or having to review the core process were kicking and screaming. They were really unhappy that they'd been forced to say this is a bad project, even though they wanted to recommend it, because the CEO had been sponsoring a transformation. That was part of the reason. It had all been fixed by the transformation project. And they were really, really unhappy that they were being pigeonholed into making this decision. So out of all that, it just seemed, it was such a remarkable demonstration of how putting all the facts to one side. And one of the participants said, it doesn't matter how much data you've got, it's irrelevant in the way that we make a decision. Another person said, well, basically, when we do this in practice, we just sit around the room, talk a lot, and we wait till the most senior person in the room tells us what we're going to do. So you've got these really interesting dynamics, which are people-driven, as opposed to the underlying data. And that's, I guess that was sort of the heart of the findings that sort of I got from this. And then we came up with some recommendations on what do you do as a practitioner? How do you address these issues?
And why do you think that when the element of risk it was introduced as opposed to it being an opportunity, why do you think that had such a significant change on the outcome?
Well, what we talked about, the project goal was about improving compliance outcomes. And the feedback from the groups was said that the core process, it read like an opportunity. It sounded positive, great, everybody get on board, where the support process just sounded like a threat. And it's, oh my God, we're going to have to do this one. The big difference was in terms of how that framing, and the difference it made was, with the opportunity, people weren't just looking at addressing the compliance outcomes. And it's a bit like that conversation. If you've got to change the sort of the spark plugs in a car, if you've got the hood up, you might as well check the oil, check the water, check the alternator, and do a few other things. So in our context, it was, maybe we can fix for the customer experience. Maybe we can generate some more revenue out of this. Maybe we can reduce the cost. And people were seeing other opportunities in the core process, whereas we were actually specifically asking them just address the compliance outcomes. And so it was how it was framed. So when you then framed it as a risk assessment, it made it harder to think of those other positive opportunities you can get when you undertake a BPM initiative.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And you mentioned earlier that in the decision making in process selection can be very subjective. Can you elaborate on the factors that contribute to making it quite subjective?
Well, it's when you look at the typical criteria. So we talked about the three generic ones: strategically important, opportunity or health, and feasibility. Well, you've got to provide data and metrics to support those. Frequently, it's very difficult to come by. And so you get down to, well, my process is more important than yours. But the other issue here is that when you get to sort of a senior level and you get the decision makers in the room, you might have, let's say, the chief risk officer from the retail division and the chief risk officer from the wholesale division. The chief risk officer may know the process very well for mortgages in retail. But they don't understand the processes for trade finance that sit within wholesale. And vice versa. The CRO for wholesale really knows trade finance, but doesn't know mortgages. And obviously, as we know, at a senior level, they tend to be quite removed from the actual nuts and bolts of what's going on in the process. So their grasp on the facts isn't as detailed as it could be. So you've got this, there's a lack of data in many cases, subjective. The other aspect of it is that the labeling of the data, this came out was really strongly, can give the game away. So in many cases, you might have a particular metric associated with a process that actually tells you what the process is. So for example, time to cash is a really common metric in mortgages. Straight through processing rate is a really common metric in payments. So if you include that in your data pack, people immediately know you're talking about payments and immediately know you're talking about mortgages, and then the bias creeps in. And this became an issue where in one of the assessments, up until now, we'd labeled them process A and process B. Process A was core, process B was support. We'd gone through all of this and it was very closely aligned. We think process A, the core process is slightly better than the support process. For one test, I said, now, if I told you that the core process is loosely based on mortgages and the support process is loosely based on KYC, on Know Your Customer, which has been the subject of a lot of the scandals in recent times, now rate them. And the difference was just extraordinary. So just by labeling the processes, you saw a complete switch and a much strengthening of the position for the support process. So you've got to try and remove that bias. And things like sort of having labels such as STP or time to cash reinforce that bias. And so we've got to get away from that.
So how do you think that you can mitigate these biases or sometimes personal conflicts among this process selection process?
So that's right at the point of where I am now. I mean, the guidelines that I've come up with, first of all, this framing, how you frame the project goal and the role of the sponsor in making it crystal clear what you want them to do. Are they allowed to look for other benefits beyond, in this case, just compliance or just cost? If the CFO is sponsoring something to get the cost out, she may really not care whether they would go after customer experience benefits. So be clear, are you looking for a broad portfolio of benefits or just a very distinct singular focus? Be really clear in your language. If you're talking about a threat, don't use words like opportunity within that focusing. There's another piece that we did which said the sponsor needs to be really clear about their position. Don't set your teams off running, capturing all this information, and then come in halfway through the process and say, well, I think this is the right one to do. If you've got a personal preference, say it up front and say why, and say that you're open to hearing alternatives. But just be straightforward with the teams doing work, because this costs a significant amount of money. So that's one thing about getting that sort of that framing of the context right. The second one is, if we think about the stages of process selection, you go through a screening out, go through an individual assessment, then a comparative assessment. That screening out is absolutely critical. This is where you need to do the last thing we did, which was the hard-nosed, here are the 5 things that are really critical, and it's yes or no. Don't sort of, if you don't say no, it's okay. This is not your turn this year to get on this project portfolio, because you don't want them to go into the subsequent stages where more resources consumed and it's more of a bun fight. As we know, this process is a real bun fight. So you screen out really hard. I think the next part is, I want to try this. I haven't sort of figured out whether practically you can work it to run like a shadow process where you don't label the processes. You don't tell people I'm doing term deposits, I'm doing sort of, the say trade finance or payments or whatever. I give them process A, process B, process C, and all the metrics that support the criteria are, once again, they are neutralized in terms of, we talk about automation rate, which covers both. So you get rid of the labels and get rid of the jargon. So that's one of the things that I think will make a huge difference. I want to this idea of a lifeline, I think, is really important. So just because something's not feasible right now at this point, when you make a decision now, the question is, can you address that without impacting the timeline of the project? And how realistic is it? And I think that for me, it was quite an important one, because when I tested both aspects here, is screen out now based on, is it feasible now? Or give them the opportunity to address the issue. There's about a 25% uplift in potential viable projects where the issues could be addressed. And so that was quite significant. You don't necessarily want to lose the value if it's just something that's not technically possible now, but it might be in 2 or 3 months' time. So that was the other one. And then I guess it's just being really aware of those personal biases, but especially around the anchoring. You deal with that right at the front. If you're going to get experts in, you bring experts in. You make sure everybody knows that before they're given the task of the assessment, you get everybody on this level playing field with the new information. So in each of the groups we had people who were familiar with process mining, but most weren't. And because they were already in process doing the selection, they ignored the experts. The experts told them you can't do this because there's no data for one of them, but they just ignored it. Right. And so you need to bring those once again right at the front end of the process.
Yeah. And what would you say was the most surprising or maybe unexpected finding from this whole research?
I think how people were prepared to undermine the process for the benefit of the organization to suit a particular agenda. Now, that sounds quite Machiavellian. I mean, I don't think people thought of that. They just thought as they were doing the right thing, you had to fight your corner. And they talked about, if you put your proposal up and it gets knocked back, well, you basically just give it a bit of a spruce up, clean up, just change a few things around and represent it to try and get it approved. As opposed to they saw that the objective was to fight tooth and nail for your process, as opposed to eliminate your process if it just doesn't fit the criteria, so that it makes it an easier process towards the end when you're getting into the real selection nitty-gritty and you're down to the last handful of processes. Having 40, 50, 60 or hundreds of alternatives at that last stage when you've spent weeks gathering the data to get to that point is such an extraordinary waste of money. And you're building people up to be let down. So it's much better to sort of let them down early.
Yeah, totally. And I'd imagine that would be
happening in many organizations right now, where there's a lot of this work going into selecting and identifying processes, and a lot of agendas in the mix there as well. And it just can complicate and make the whole process very complex.
It's I think the polite term for it it's bun fight. And especially, say, when you've got people that you're trying to do a comparative evaluation, but they have such different backgrounds and different understanding, it's a flawed process. It's never going to work because you're not dealing apples with apples. And I don't know how to get around that. I think there's a comment somewhere in the literature that I read that, very few people have equal visibility of all the processes. I'd say I don't know anybody does, because if you're in the process office, you know it from a process office perspective, but you certainly don't know those processes from being an operator on the ground and running them day to day, or being the accountable process owner that is having to deal with all the issues that permeates through them every day. So it's practically impossible for any one individual to have equal knowledge across all the alternatives that you're facing. Now, there's lots of tools that try to sort of to do this and deal with some of the subjectivity factors. The analytical hierarchy process is one I use quite a bit, but it's painful to do because you're doing pairwise comparison. If you've got 100 processes to select from, pairwise comparison on that can take a long time, and people lose the will to live. So it's recognizing that this bias is there, recognizing that the subjectivity is there, and just dealing with it the way, that you can try to minimize the effects of this.
Yeah, great. And for someone listening right now, that they're from an organization, maybe everything you're talking about is a bit of a light bulb moment for them, or they're realizing, we're going through this at the moment. What's the first thing that they should be considering, thinking about, spending their time, effort, and energy on to make this process selection process more fruitful, more valuable, more beneficial for the organization?
So, it's sort of reasonably timely. We're probably, by the time this goes to air, we'll be just in the start of a new financial year in Australia. Overseas, we'll be sort of, you've got a good few months as we go through that end of the second half of the year, ready for the new year. And process selection is, I don't know any organization that doesn't have to do it. They may call it the project selection, process selection. It's very similar processes that you go through. And so I would say do the framing, be clear about the context, get those contextual factors absolutely nailed, and really work with your process sponsor, or the project sponsor, to be absolutely crystal clear about what they want. The more woolly they are in terms of describing what they're looking for, the more difficult the process will be to run. And then to try to take away some of the loaded terminology that automatically, if I'd have said right at the very start of this, I've got a mortgage process and a KYC process, which you're going to pick. Because of recently what's happened in this particular Australian context, everybody would pick KYC. I could have written absolute drivel, but they would still pick KYC because the scars run so deep from what's happened in the industry. So you've got to try and remove that. And I think there's a really important role for the process office here. And that is to create that initial pack that can be used to screen out, where they can actually draft the descriptions of the processes. So they can neutralize the language. They can come up with some of the common metrics. They can come up with the critical factors to use for screen out. They can run that process, and it can be a relatively quick process as well. And as long as the sort of the decision makers and the process owners are briefed that we are being deliberately brutal here. Don't feel that you've necessarily got a bad process just because it fails these 5 questions. It's just in this particular context, we've got a very clear goal, and we can't afford to go through, evaluating 100 processes with hundreds of hours worth of work attached to each, or thousands of hours worth of work attached to each. We need to be brutal right at the start.
Yeah, and can you flesh that out a little bit more about that potential consequence there? You're talking about hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. What are the potential consequences an organisation will face if they don't sort of tackle these challenges, address these challenges?
It's about wasted resource. Every organization has got limited resources, and they need to be putting their resources to work on the things which are going to have the biggest impact. And if you've got BAU teams that are spending lots of their time trying to package up and craft a story or a narrative that they think they can sort of, just manage to navigate their way through the hurdles to get a bit of resource funding, when it's not the right process, they could be spending their time working on their continuous improvement, working on their quality, just running the business really, really well. And now that's challenging for many people, because they have in their mind that if you want to succeed from a performance perspective individually, you need to change. You need to be seen to be transforming. But we can't all do it, because the worst thing that I've seen is people not having the money, still trying to transform without the right resources attached to it, without the sort of the right skills, without the right organizational support. And they take a good process and turn it into a dreadful process and stuff it up in the meantime. So much better just to sort of get through that and not have the frustration of having spent 3 months, 2 months going through a prioritization process to be pipped at the post. So for me, I would rather, if my process doesn't fit the criteria, I'd like to know it right up front so I can get on with other stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And looking towards the future, how can organizations get better at this whole topic of process selection? Will technology play a significant part in this? For those that are asking the question, and now what would you say to them?
Well, there's a lot of technology goes into this already. I said there's some superb tools out there. Now, if you have an audience, which, let's say you've got a predominantly an engineering type audience, which is looking for facts and data, then there are some superb tools out there to help you. And there's a good chance that, you will be able to rely more on an objective assessment as opposed to the subjective assessment. If you've got an audience that is maybe not as engineering type inclined, or where the data just genuinely doesn't exist, so it's very difficult to get the data, then you're going to have to think of some ways around this. Now, once again, there are techniques to do it, but it's hard to get those senior decision makers in a room to go through those motions. So that's why you end up having the talk fest, and then the senior person in the room just says, right, we're going to do process A. So just, I think context is everything. It depends on the nature of the organization. Where you have an organization where this is a significant problem, people get, there's a lot of raised voices, a lot of contention. It's iterative. It takes a long time to get through it. They're good indicators that this is a difficult process. So that's where you try to work on some of those pre-processing steps where the COE can play that significant role to try and, they take away as much of the subjectivity as possible to get that out, to get that sort of very clean, crisp screening stage complete, where people feel okay about it. So, you don't have to feel great that your process hasn't been selected, but at least you know the rationale. And that was that came through very, very strongly. There was another great example where the core process in my scenario, we said the regulator is very happy with where it is at this point in time and the roadmap that's in place for the transformation project. So if you're trying to fix regulatory outcomes and the regulator is okay and is not really concerned about it, it would seem an obvious one to exclude. Oh no. If the regulator's been interested in it once, then they're always interested in it. So it was, even interpreting simple statements, can send people off down a burrow. So the shorter, the sharper the focus, the more you get the COE to explain at the front. People don't think as though I've wasted, hundreds of hours or tens of hours of my own time. If you'd only told me that right at the beginning. I did a little assessment where the project sponsor came back at the end of the selection process and basically undermined everything that each of the groups had said and said the opposite. And I asked for feedback from the participants, and they were livid. Someone said, we would report the CRO to the CEO because they're not sort of, fulfilling their duties. Others would just said, why on earth didn't they say that right at the start? So it's about being very clear and crisp in your communication about what the goals of the process are, what the steps are we will go through. It's just good process design. I don't think there's anything, but the materials you're dealing with are subjective. And you have to accommodate that in that process design.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think process selection, it's a big topic. It's an important topic. And I've certainly been loving this conversation and learning a lot from you, Nigel. For those that are listening to this and they want to learn more, they want to understand, well, maybe they've recognized this is a huge issue. This is a huge problem for our organization. Where do they go to, I guess, continue learning about this topic and how can they best move forward and make some valuable steps?
Well, I mean, I guess the textbook I started with when I was doing this research, I'll just have a look at it. It's the business process management, the fundamentals of business process management. Marlon Dumas and the guys, and it's very clear on this piece. Now, once you get into it, as I said, most of the focus is on what are the techniques for evaluating criteria, but they're dependent on data. And what I've been discussing is when you don't really have that data. But Marlon's book is a great way to start with this, and there's a truckload around it. But also just speaking to your fellow practitioners, because the war stories that people have, as I say, the number of times I've gone in and I've been absolutely convinced what the right answer is, only to come out with a completely different answer and thinking, oh, okay, that seems plausible. And there's nearly always, but it's the one last thing I would say, I would really go to is know your audience. Really, if you are the process office running this particular piece of work, get to know the decision makers. Get to know what their agenda are, what their personal objectives are, who their alliances are, who their stakeholders, who they communicate with, who they don't communicate well with, what success looks like for each individual, because in a subjective process, it becomes heavily politicized. And the more you understand the politics of each individual decision-making at the steering committee, the easier it will be for you to craft and design that pre-screening step and the rest of the process. But it's about because and people are fickle and they'll change. So yeah, that makes it fun. Actually, it makes it sort of if it was just a question of pushing a button on a tool, or then it'd be a little bit boring. But this is what makes it sort of a fun part of the process. But it can be a little bit easier on the nerves.
Definitely. No, people are definitely a huge part of the whole process, and having those interpersonal skills to be able to understand, well, who's in front of me? Who am I talking with right now? How do I need to change and adapt my language? One, for their context and where they're coming from, but also I'm going to put yourself in their shoes. What's going through their head? What are the key measures and the key metrics and the key drivers and motivators that are really driving their decisions? And some of it might be logical, but I think a lot of humans, we make emotional decisions. We make decisions based on our feelings, and so it is a huge part of it.
There's the most successful one of these I've seen, actually. This was back in about sort of 2008, I think it was, and it was the leadership team of the operations function, and they were going through which programs of work are we going to go through next year. And one of those leaders stood up and said, "Look, I had sort of quite a lot of investment last year. We are still bedding that down. I think it's not my turn this year. Someone else should. So I'm not going to put any projects forward for approval." And that was one of the most mature things that I've ever heard, because usually everybody puts stuff forward and let the games begin. And this was it was such a mature team in terms of how it navigated this, by individuals recognizing that sometimes it's just not your year to get the money.
Yeah, right. No, that's fantastic. Well, Nigel, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know the audience has as well. So I really appreciate that. For anyone that wants to continue this conversation, maybe Nigel's left you with some more questions in your mind that you want answered, then by all means, reach out to him on LinkedIn, get in touch. I'm sure he'd love to be able to discuss this with you further. And I know, Nigel, you've got a number of different papers and reports as well out there that we can all glean from and learn from. So,
and I'll share. There's a particular paper on the actual process of prioritization. I'll share that link with you, Daniel, afterwards as well. You can maybe attach that to the session.
Perfect. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Nigel. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Cheers, Daniel.